Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 20th meeting in 2013 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off their mobile phones, etc., because leaving them on can affect the sound system. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking in private. The issue is related to the Regulatory Reform Bill, which are we all agreed to do so? We are agreed. Thank you very much. So we will take that item in private. Agenda item 2 is on the Regulatory Reform Bill evidence. The second item today is our final evidence session with the Minister for Environment and Climate Change. And I would like to welcome Paul Wheelhouse, our Minister, who can introduce his staff. And if you wish to make any opening statement, that would be fine.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Committee. If I could introduce from my immediate right, we have Neil Watt, who is the Bill Manager and, from Better Environmental Regulation Policy, Environmental Quality Division. I have Bridget Marshall from the Better Environmental Regulation Policy and Environmental Quality Division, and George Burgess, who is Deputy Director for Environmental Quality, Scottish Government.
Thank you. Do you wish to make any opening remarks?
I would, Convener, if you're willing. Thank you again for inviting me to give evidence on the bill this morning. This administration is focused on building a dynamic and growing economy that will provide prosperity and opportunities for all, while ensuring that future generations can enjoy a better quality of life too. This bill is an integral part of the Scottish Government's sustainable growth agenda and reflects the fact that the protection of our environment and the sustainable management of our natural resources is not only a valuable objective in its own right, but is critical to both economic growth and the health and well-being of our communities. Today is United Nations World Environment Day. It is appropriate, therefore, that we are meeting on this day to discuss a bill that will provide a framework that will protect and improve Scotland's internationally recognised environment. I've been following the committee's scrutiny of the bill, particularly the very constructive roundtable meeting with key stakeholders last week, and I believe this reflects the stakeholder-led and evidence-based approach we've taken in developing these joint SEPA Scottish Government proposals. As you're already familiar with the content of the bill, from the detailed evidence given at these sessions, I'll refrain from providing another overview. I would, however, like to start with my view of the principles the Better Environmental Regulation is intended to achieve. The objective of this bill and the wider programme it supports is not deregulation. It is about delivering necessary regulatory outcomes more effectively. Consistent, proportionate and targeted regulation is needed to deliver the benefits for our economy, communities and environment, and to support delivery of the Scottish Government's purpose. The statutory purpose for SEPA that the bill will introduce will give recognition to the broader role that SEPA now has, and will recognise the importance of the environment to our economy and the health and well-being of our communities. It is important to note, however, that while this purpose is new, the need to balance environmental, economic and social considerations is not. As you have heard in evidence, balancing judgments are already taken by SEPA, SNH and other regulators on a daily basis. The new statutory purpose for SEPA formalises what is already current practice. It helps provide a line of sight from the Scottish Government's purpose to what our public bodies actually deliver. Let me be clear, however, that this is not about sacrificing the environment to promote economic growth, as some have suggested. As is right and proper, SEPA's primary purpose is and will remain the protection and improvement of the environment. It reflects that we cannot look at issues in isolation. I know this committee is also interested in the impacts of the bill on other regulators from my portfolio, such as SNH. Like SEPA, SNH already contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth, for example in their work supporting farming, commercial forestry, renewable energy and tourism as just a few examples. The Regulatory Reform Bill will help ensure a consistency of approach across regulators and demonstrate that the public sector is working together. The proportionate, risk-based framework of environmental regulation which the bill enables will better protect the environment, help legitimate businesses to flourish and protect communities. I take pleasure in highlighting that there will be losers from this work, the criminals and the entrenched poor performers. This is all about providing a level playing field and protecting communities and the environment from harm. The new framework will be easier for both regulated businesses and SEPA to understand and administer, and will lead to efficiencies for both. As a result of the bill, SEPA will change the way it prioritises its regulatory activities. so that its resources are directed towards the most important, highest risk activities that have the greatest actual or potential environmental impact on communities. SEPA will continue to work closely with those it regulates and other interested parties to help unwind complexity and deliver a more joined-up regulatory approach. This committee has already heard examples of how SEPA is working proactively with key sectors to help make improvements on the ground, and I welcome the contributions from NFU Scotland, Scottish Whisky Association and Scottish Water in this regard. In relation to enforcement, the bill will give SEPA a wider, more strategic range of tools to deploy. Combined with the new sentencing options given to the criminal courts, these will play a key role in tackling poor performance and non-compliance. And the polluter pays principle is already widely accepted and supported. These proportionate enforcement powers will ensure that it is the criminals who pay the price for remedying damage done to the environment. All responsible businesses, large and small, will benefit from an effective environmental protection system for Scotland. And by focusing resources on the greatest environmental harms, SEPA can more effectively target lawbreakers, support non-compliers to become compliant with regulations, and protect communities and our natural environment. Convener, in conclusion, the bill is a product of extensive engagement with stakeholders, and we remain committed to listening to our stakeholders and acting on feedback received from both formal and informal consultation. And I'd like to highlight that SEPA, the Crown Office and the Scottish Government have jointly arranged a stakeholder event next week to look at the enforcement measures in more detail. And this will be the first in a series of better environmental regulation workshops that will be running in the months ahead. I'm committed to maintaining this level of engagement as we move forward with this programme, and I'm very happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Minister. I think we'll kick off with some questions about the term sustainable economic growth. Where did this originate? And does it mean economically sustainable growth or economic growth within the limits of ecological and social sustainability?
Well, the term, obviously we have a definition of sustainable economic growth, which has been highlighted by Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth in a written PQ S4W 10994 on the 20th of November last year, and he stated, building a dynamic and growing economy that will provide prosperity and opportunities for all, while ensuring the future generations can enjoy a better quality of life too. There is no sort of compelling case for inclusion of a definition. I know some have been calling for a definition of sustainable economic growth in Part 1 of the bill, which we consider to be all about supporting and empowering regulators to be accountable for the often complex and difficult decisions they take. There is obviously a clear definition of sustainable economic. There's also a very good definition of sustainable development. And I understand that Environment Link and others strongly support and have highlighted as one of the best examples of a definition of sustainable development there is, and that's in the current Scottish Planning Policy and NPF 2. And that's something that's been taken forward in current consideration of NPF 3 and indeed the review of the consultation of Scottish Planning Policy. The two things are not mutually exclusive. We have regulators that have a primary function to regulate on the environment, but they can also be empowered to take into account issues regarding economic development as well.
I want to tease these out a little further because whilst there may be an issue about the need for a definition in this part of the bill, it might be that we need to have some clarity later on. But, you know, we have to tease out a little further about this intention of using the term. Does it give extra weight towards economic growth in policy decisions, or is it a subset of sustainable development?
Well, as I was saying earlier on, Convener, I mean, one of the key things we want to achieve with the bill is greater transparency. As I stated in my opening statement, there's already a degree of the regulators, such as SEPA, having to take into account economic issues when making decisions. Their primary function is obviously, in the case of SEPA, it's an environmental one. There is a hierarchy, if you like, of duties. But when it comes to, so the primary function is to look after the environment and protect the environment. But it's not unreasonable to suggest in a situation, for example, where you have two options for a project, both of which have a similar environmental impact, or positive or negative, that economic considerations are then taken into account in deciding which of those two goes forward as recommended by SEPA. So that's a potential positive that comes from formalising something that's already happening informally and making it transparent. But clearly, sustainable development principles are very important. But we're having line of sight in these provisions in the bill to the government's overarching purpose, so that there's a consistency of approach across all our regulators, that they are having line of sight to that overarching purpose, but doesn't take away from their primary function, which is, in this case, in regards to SEPA, for example, would be to protect the environment.
Okay. Claudia Beamish, come in on that point.
Good morning, Minister. And could we pursue that a little further? Would the purpose and effect of the bill change significantly if the duty to contribute to achieving sustainable development was included rather than sustainable economic growth? And I've listened very carefully to what you've said and done my best to read some of the evidence and definitions. I'm completely taking the point that has been made that in this case, in relation to what the bill is doing, will do, that the environmental aspects of those duties are the overriding priority. I wonder the extent to which sustainable development might be a more appropriate phrase to, or term to use, I should say, on the face of the bill in view of that, and in view of the fact that it takes into account the environmental and economic and social aspects. And without wanting to labour the point, it is enshrined in European legislation and also, as you've already said yourself, Minister, in MPF 2, and I believe in the Climate Change and the Marine Act as well. So I wondered, I think it would be helpful if you could comment on whether it would be better to use that.
Well, it's a fair point. I think the point I would make, and maybe in fairness, sort of referring to something I didn't really answer in respect to the convener's question as well, I think take the two together, that sustainable development and sustainable economic growth are clearly related principles, but they are not necessarily distinct. They are distinct concepts. I take the point about the sort of the social aspect, the environmental aspects of sustainable development, which are not as explicit perhaps in the definition I read out earlier in terms of sustainable economic growth. I suppose the value in having sustainable economic growth explicitly set out as a duty is it gives, as I say, clear line of sight and clear consistency of approach taken across all regulators in respect to the government economic strategy. Obviously, the government economic strategy has now at its heart objectives in terms of low carbon economic growth, and that's a specific strand of the strategy. We are taking in parallel steps to ensure that all public bodies will ultimately hopefully sign up to a duty on biodiversity as well, as part of in support of the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, which will soon be launched. We have public duties in respect of climate change, as I'm sure you know, arising from the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009. So there are a number of different public duties that are out there, which would ensure that the environment is certainly taken into account in regards to activities of all public bodies, including the regulators. But the value of having sustainable economic growth specifically in there gives that line of sight to exactly what's in the government economic strategy. But I take on board the point, could we be more explicit about sustainable development principles, and that's something we can take away and reflect. But I wouldn't want to lose the link, if I could put it in that term, between sustainable economic growth, which empowers the regulators to take those matters into account, where you've got a finely balanced decision, where perhaps you've got, as I say, very similar outcomes on environmental impact terms. It empowers the regulators to actually take economic impact into account in the decision as well, to, if you like, recommend approach B versus approach A, which maybe they have more of an impact on the economy and therefore benefit the society of Scotland more explicitly. But I'm happy to take on board the member's point and maybe come back to you on that.
Briefly, please.
You can bring in George Burgess as well.
Yes, I wonder if it might help if we look specifically at section 38 of the bill and the new general purpose for SEPA, because that actually brings together these various concepts. Now, when we were giving evidence in front of this committee, I think 2 weeks ago, we had a bit of a look at this section. And what that is providing is the primary purpose for SEPA of protecting and improving the environment, and the subsidiary purposes of improving the health and well-being and achieving sustainable economic growth. I see those three taken together as sustainable development, and indeed our initial proposals on the bill were that an existing duty in the Environment Act 1995 that required ministers to give guidance to SEPA on the contribution that they should make in exercising their functions, the contribution to sustainable development, we saw that as actually superfluous, because really the new purpose was sustainable development written out longhand, if you like. We responded to views from stakeholders of not wanting to see the word sustainable development disappear, so that requirement for ministers to provide guidance on the contribution to sustainable development will actually remain in legislation alongside the purpose that we've set out, and we would envisage that a single set of guidance on the new purpose and on the contribution to sustainable development is the place where we can actually articulate very clearly how the terms interrelate. So, as I see it, sustainable economic growth, a component of sustainable development, but not, as the Minister said, not one and the same thing.
If I may, Convener, just add one point. I mean, we're also, alongside guidance, we're obviously improving the kind of tools that are available in terms of making decisions about the linkage between economic and environmental matters with, albeit early days, the welcome introduction natural capital index, and an evolving approach in terms of ecosystem services. So we're understanding, if you like, what environmental investments can deliver in terms of economic gain, and vice versa, what economic investments can deliver for the environment in terms of those kind of linkages. And that will help not only those who are promoting projects, but also regulators to understand better the kind of linkages between the economy and environmental issues.
You know, Minister, I still am puzzled, and I wonder if you could help me with the fact that if sustainable development is going to be part of, form part of the guidance definitions, why we don't see it here on the face of the bill, and I think it might help reassure a number of the stakeholders who have made comment.
I do take the point, Convener, that perhaps it's lacking an explicit link. I think George Burgess has explained, how we feel that some aspects of the bill already collectively deliver, if you like, the outcome that you're seeking. But I take the point in terms of making an explicit link. But I would want to lose sight of the fact that it's very important, I think, that there is a consistency and this kind of line of sight issue is delivered by bringing in sustainable economic growth into the bill explicitly. And that's why the focus has been on sustainable economic growth, which is one of obviously the government's overarching purpose, and is a clear link between the government economic strategy and the regulators that interact with the economic community.
If I may, the reference to sustainable development is already there in the Environment Act 1995. So we don't need to refer to it in the bill because it's already there in the statute.
That's in section 20 of the Environment Act, is it?
I think it's in a section up in the 30s, but it's in the same part of the Environment Act.
You could remind us exactly.
Nigel
Don wants to come in.
Thank you, Vina. Can I just elaborate on this? Could I pick up on George Burgess's comment about section 38 and the I do beg your pardon, and on the duty for SEPA, and that very helpful hierarchy that says quite simply that the environment comes first and the other 2 points come subordinate to that. Could I put it to the Minister that I think it would help us, and maybe many of those we've already heard from, if the general duties within the Act had a similar kind of hierarchical approach? Because I think one of the points about sustainable economic growth is that we're not quite sure whether it's the environment that comes first or the economy that comes first. I'm getting the impression that you feel the environment comes first, but that is explicitly stated in section 38. If that were explicitly stated as the general tenor of all the other duties for the other regulators, then I think that would overcome, to some extent, our problem about what the words mean. I don't think the problem is actually in the words, it's knowing what they mean and what the hierarchy of duties is.
It's, Convener, it's a reasonable point, but I'm not the lead minister for the bill. I will certainly take that back to Fergus Ewing and see if there's an approach that we can find there to accommodate that concern. However, it's just worth stating, obviously, in respect of those environmental regulators, that hierarchy effectively is in place in terms of having the environment will remain the overarching responsibility, and then economic interests come secondary. But I think George Burgess wants to come in.
Just very quickly to answer the convener's question, the reference to sustainable development and the guidance power is in section 31 of the Environment Act 1995.
Very much for that. And following on in this vein, with Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. My questions will relate to the codes of practice. How will the code of practice define sustainable economic growth so that it's readily understood and applied to the functions of all the 10 listed regulators? And given the diverse nature of the remits, is one single code of practice sufficient, or should each regulator receive detailed, specific guidance on their remit?
Mr. Day raises a very fair point. I mean, the code will apply to all regulators listed in Schedule 1 of the bill and will not be specific to any particular regulator. It will support regulators as they deliver on their economic duty, and it's being developed by regulators and by business to capture and encourage best practice. It will very deliberately be the subject of substantive consultation and subject to parliamentary scrutiny prior to its introduction. So that's something I think will be important, and obviously give the opportunity for those with an interest in the delivery on the ground, the opportunity to comment on the code of practice and guidance. I don't know whether George would like to address the first point, or Neil.
If I can come in there. I mean, I think that the code is being developed with the regulators, and it is exactly the purpose to clarify on the practicalities of how they will deliver this part of the bill. That is the purpose of the regulators being part of this group developing the code.
Forgive me, it must be quite challenging to come up with what by definition is going to be quite a broad code, which is going to cover things as diverse as charities, housing, tourism, healthcare. How do you actually make it relevant to such a diverse group?
I think, as the Minister said, it's all about providing line of sight to the government's purpose, and I think we need, we are kind of moving from part 1 of the bill to part 2 of the bill, section 5, and talking about SEPA's purpose, and then come back to part 1. And I think, the part 1 of the bill, the duty in part 1 of the bill is not sort of establishing a new purpose for all these regulators. This is introducing a new duty, and I think it's important that it does sort of talk to, as you say, the range of regulators involved. And my earlier point about them being involved in the development of this code of practice, about how it's going to actually work in practice, how it's going to be implemented, is important. So I think, I'd like to think that, a lot of the work will come with input from the regulators themselves into how it actually will work in practice.
We've touched in previous evidence sessions about, are we in effect going to have a pyramid type system where you've got this broad code sitting on the top, and underneath it there will be specific policy guidance, etc. for the regulators? Is that in practice what's going to happen here?
I would imagine it's a fair point that you raise, Deputy Convener, about the interpretation, I suppose, and it will be difficult, I think, in practice to have something which is explicit for every specific sector as to how to interpret it. But I guess it's about providing guidance as to the approach to be taken in interpretation of guidance, and I suppose there's guidance and guidance in some respects. It's often needed, as I'm sure you've experienced yourself. But it's a point I think that we'll need to come back to the committee on, about how we cover those areas which are beyond my portfolio in terms of tourism and other sectors which would be the public duty would be applicable to, but clearly I don't have as in-depth knowledge of those sectors as Mr. Ewing would do. But we can come back to the committee if that would be helpful to you.
Thank you. I appreciate the difficulty you have in that regard, Minister. Can I move on to look at the issue of, given that ministers already have primary powers, to issue codes of practice with respect to the enforcement of food law, should a caveat be introduced, I think as the SFA has suggested, that clarifies that S5 does not prejudice these similar powers, and should indeed a caveat of this nature include all regulators?
I think, is there sort of concern about, in any respect, about how it might influence the FSA? Is it, maybe just expand on that?
Forgive me, Convener, I think that it was they who suggested that some clarity in this regard would be useful.
I think the new powers are intended to complement the duties that bodies such as FSA have, and not to circumvent or prejudice, as you say, the other powers that they have.
I think this is in keeping with themes we've touched on earlier about greater clarity about what the bill's about. I think there is an issue there, is there not?
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose there's some fundamental principles, as I was trying to set out in the opening statement. We're trying to make sure that, unlike perhaps the agenda elsewhere in these islands about deregulation, we're trying to improve, although it appears it's not as easy as we maybe intend, to try and improve the clarity, the transparency of what's happening. As I said earlier on, that there's already informally, in respect to the public duty issue, that the regulators are already taking economic issues into account. So this is enshrining something formally so that it's transparent, clear. We're trying to introduce greater consistency across regulators, and hence, having a code of guidance which will inform that will be very helpful. We are trying to ensure there's greater proportionality, which I'm sure we'll come on to in terms of later questioning, so I won't stray there just now. So there's some key principles that are at play here, and hopefully that will benefit all sorts of regulators. And as Neil was saying, it's intended that the new code will support and encourage consistent regulation and those principles and compliance with regulatory principles. It is not intended to circumvent in any way or replace other codes of practice.
That's reassuring, thank you.
Can I come in briefly?
Yes, please.
The issues that the committee's sort of discussing with us today and heard in evidence are the kind of issues that were kind of teased out the consultation that our Better Regulation colleagues ran, and the kind of issues that I think are appearing in Enterprise Committee's scrutiny of that part of the bill too. And I think we are trying to act, genuinely trying to act on these concerns and work through them with stakeholders, and the commitment to develop the code with regulators and other interested parties, and to obviously ensure it's subject to parliamentary scrutiny as part of that process. And I think we are accepting and acknowledging the concerns that you're raising this morning.
Okay. Fine, thank you. We'll note that just now. Jim Hume to follow on.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Just regarding the draft code of practice, again, it states that under S64B that they'll consider who is appropriate to be consulted on the draft code of practice. Who would you consider as being appropriate organisations, etc., to be consulted?
Well, it's an important point you raise. I mean, I know that's something that has been raised by others as well. I mean, the clause does guarantee that we'll consult with relevant regulators and with stakeholders appropriate to them. So we are committed to an inclusive and open approach in undertaking a consultation, and nothing in the drafting of the bill suggests otherwise, I would hope. I'm aware that there may be an issue about separate lists and making sure that there's sort of consistency of approach in terms of who's consulted. I'm aware that so far, at least, all stakeholders seem to be relatively happy with the degree of consultation that's been undertaken up to this point, and we're keen to keep that engagement going, as I said in my opening statement. We will, try and be clear about who we will consult on the code and who we would consult perhaps on secondary regulation and at some point in the future. We will have the ongoing consultation exercise in issues like air quality and other respects as well. So that can all be taken in the round. But if it would help, we can try and provide. I'll have a discussion with Fergus and come back to the committee with greater clarity, if you like, on who we will consult in different stages.
I think that would be useful, but just to further that on, when we had our stakeholders here, I think all of them, at least there was no dissent to the view that the consultation should go out to the broad public, wider society. Was that something that you'd perhaps consider?
Well, I suppose the key thing is we make sure that those who have a direct relevant interest in particular measures are consulted. But maybe ask George to address the wider point about how we bring in the wider public on consulting on some of the measures.
You mentioned there's a very diverse amount of people. Just about anybody and everybody could be affected indirectly or directly.
I think it'd be fair to say, in terms of the environmental sphere, we have a pretty good handle on who our stakeholders are in relation to the interactions with SEPA, interactions with SNH, and we've got a very active stakeholder community who work very well with our regulators and indeed with government. But maybe ask George to address the wider point that you raised, Mr. Hume.
Yes, I wonder whether requirements like this, that there must be consultation with particular parties, are maybe rather old-fashioned and from an earlier day when only particular people were consulted and not the wider public. I think practice, certainly over the last decade, has been that any consultation like this would be an open public consultation. It would appear on the Scottish Government website. There would be absolutely no restriction on people feeding into it. I think they do have some value in making sure that, as well as the general open consultation, there has to be consultation with particular parties. But I can't think when there was the last closed consultation that only certain people were allowed to respond to. So I think if you look at what the practice of government has been, it is a practice of open consultations that anyone can feed into, and they're widely available and easy ways for stakeholders to be aware of upcoming consultations.
I think it'd be also fair to say that we're obviously conscious of the degree to which there's consultation overload for some stakeholders as well. But the point I was making earlier on was we need to make sure that the ones who are absolutely critical to interact are aware that the consultation is happening, and to notify and make sure we try and get their views on board. And as George says, they're not closing off consultation to others, but it's about making sure those that need to know that consultation is happening are aware of it, and so they don't miss the opportunity to feed into it.
Just to get pure clarity on this, because and get it on the record, I suppose. So you'll engage with some to make sure that they engage with this consultation, but it shall also be open to the public as...
Happy to. I mean, as George says, that's the general practice that's available, and I think it's an important principle, I suppose, of this Parliament, that it's always been open and transparent to the public.
And I mean, I guess it's probably a stereotype that we sort of sit at our desk and wait for all the written responses to come in. As someone who literally looks at the consultation responses, it's not just about reading the letters. We're encouraged to get out there and actually speak to people, and I hope that we've managed to do that with the area policy that I'm responsible for. And we're very happy to. I'd like nothing better, frankly, to get out of the office and do that. So I mean, that's the other aspect of this. It's not just about the formal element, important as it is.
That's cleared it up quite well, thanks.
Thank you. Richard Lyle.
Can I welcome, thank you, Convener. Morning, Minister. Can I welcome the comment that Neil Watts just made? He's going to be out and talking to people and ask them. So we have many regulators who already have duties to report on sustainable development. How would you alleviate their concerns, and how they would meaningfully distinguish between and report on their duty to contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth? What concerns, if they have any concerns when you're out in your visits, what would you say to them?
Sorry, I think you addressed that to me.
I mean, do you mean in terms of regulators generally, or SEPA specifically?
Yeah. No, regulators generally.
I mean, I suppose I think there's a very sort of good understanding of the government's purpose, and we've already had a discussion about the sort of definition of the terms that we've used. I'd like to think that when this is picked up specifically in the Code of Practice, the discussion will be specifically on the sort of practical implementation of it, and about, we're talking about the principles of better regulation, how we can ensure transparency and consistency across regulators. So I mean, that's the sort of purpose of having this duty, and that's the sort of kind of discussions I'll be having when we come together and have the discussions.
I'm a regulator, Mr. Neil Watt. I don't know what sustainable economic growth means. What does it mean to you?
Well, if I can pick up on that point, Mr. Lyle, I suppose it's easier to look at it from the point of view if Mr. Lyle was SEPA, if we can put it in those terms, for the purpose of the argument, and I'm sure you enjoy that role. If we were looking at as regulators such as SEPA, the provisions in the Environment Act 1995 that George Burgess referred to earlier on, section 31, I think it was, that was referred to, require ministers to provide SEPA with guidance on the contribution it should make towards attaining the objective of achieving sustainable development. And that will remain alongside their new clear statutory purpose, which is relating to sustainable economic development, sustainable economic growth rather. So we obviously are going to develop a code of guidance which will make it clear how to interpret that public duty, the new public duty in terms of sustainable economic growth. So they'll have that clarity, if you like, from that side of the House. And also the requirements are set out in the Environment Act 1995 to deal with the sustainable development aspects. The guidance will be appropriate place to tease out the relationship between the two concepts, so we can try and, there is a degree of overlap clearly, but as Claudia Beamish referred to earlier, there are matters which are taken into account in sustainable development that aren't as explicit in sustainable economic growth, like environment and the social aspects of that principle. So we can set out in guidance, if you like, the additional things which go beyond sustainable development, which are sustainable growth rather, that are covered in sustainable development. And SEPA is already subject to duties to provide annual reports on its functions, as other public bodies will be as well. And we expect that future annual reports will report on the outcomes of the new duties. As I said earlier on, I think in response to an earlier question, we were looking at the public duty in respect to biodiversity. We would expect SEPA, SNH, other regulators to report on that, as well as their impact in terms of climate mitigation and climate change, and clearly in this case in terms of sustainable economic growth and sustainable development. And I do think it's important we give them appropriate guidance, so it's a fair point that you raise, but that's something we need to work up in consultation with stakeholders.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And following on from there, Alex Ferguson.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, if I picked you up right in your answer to the very first question, you said, I think I'm right, that Scottish Environment Link had a very clear understanding of the definition of sustainable economic growth. Now, that was sustainable development. Yes. Ah, right. I'm glad. Thank you for putting me right on that. Because one of the things that Scottish Environment Link told us last week was that they suggested to us that the concept of sustainable economic growth was so poorly understood that it could actually lead to what they called a paralysis of indecision from regulators that could, in extremis, lead to challenges in the courts. Now, if you are placing a duty to contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth, that, to me, suggests that there needs to be a way of measuring and monitoring whether the regulator has actually upheld that duty. Can I ask how you intend to do that?
Well, it's a point probably should have raised earlier on myself, but thank you for the opportunity to address it again. A short life working group is going to be established comprising business representatives, regulators, including SEPA, SNH, COSLA. That's being established to develop the code of practice, which will be, obviously, as we said earlier on, will be consulted on prior to introduction. The regulatory bodies, other regulatory bodies which are not involved in that working group will be kept informed and invited to contribute to it. So there's not that, even if they're not directly involved in the working group, they will still have the opportunity to feed into the guidance, to give the, if you like, the support in terms of how to interpret and give clarity, if you like, as to how to interpret sustainable economic growth and therefore how to report on it as well. So what sort of things are, if you like, the key features of sustainable economic growth and the measures that would be relevant for them to report on. That will be a kind of key outcome to support consistent and appropriate decision making as well, because obviously we want consistency across regulators, but they need to have a consistent understanding of what the concepts are and what the requirements are of them. And we'd hope to use the bill, this bill and the development of the code as an opportunity to further raise awareness and understanding among regulators to address the concerns that Environment Link and others may have expressed.
Can I just briefly ask as a follow-up to that, Minister, if, and that's good news that the short life work group is going to be established, I think. Will it also be able to look at how, what enforcement procedures might be used if there is a case that a regulator is found not to be upholding their duty?
Well, certainly, consultation on enforcement is going to be I think, a key element, we do need to ensure that that all regulators and all actors understand the relationship between the public duty and the regulator, the interpretation of those public duties, and indeed the linkages to enforcement, where harms are being caused to the objectives of the regulator, I suppose, so they understand at what point they come in. But I don't know whether Neil would like to contact.
I think if we're looking more broadly across regulators as a whole, it wouldn't be very in line with principles of better regulation to introduce huge new reporting requirements. And I think that there's well-established governance structures in place for regulators and public bodies to report on their performance and their contribution to the government's purpose. And the new requirement will fit into these structures. It's not about creating something new or adding an extra burden. We don't want to take away resources from frontline delivery or anything like that. But I think it's just about transparency here and consistency across them, not about radical change.
Yes, I accept. Sorry, if I may, just very briefly. I do accept that entirely. But if you're putting a duty on a regulator to come up with a certain aim, and they fail to do so, then surely there has to be some mechanism of drawing that to their attention and seeking other actions that will actually assure everybody that the duty is being upheld. That's what a duty is.
Clearly, I suppose regulators like SEPA, SNH, in the case of my portfolio, are accountable to ministers in terms of delivery on those outcomes. So obviously there'll be interaction with those regulators as to what they could do to improve their performance. They already do report to me, for example. Recently had reports back from SNH and SEPA in terms of their outcomes in relation to Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 and the steps they are taking to reduce their damaging greenhouse gas emissions. So, and good progress is being made, but occasionally there are bumps along the way, and they write to me to explain what the reason was for failure to deliver in a particular area and what steps they're taking to address that in the forthcoming year. So, there is a sort of a mechanism there, but I'm happy to sort of take the committee's view if they feel there are any particular issues that we could look at.
Yeah, well, that's helpful. Thank you.
We're following on. Jane Baxter.
Thank you. Morning. Minister, you've in your previous answer, you strayed a wee bit into the territory of the question I was going to ask, but I think I'll no, it's good. I think I'll still ask it just so that we can be clear that we've got, for the record, that we've got an understanding. So I was going to say, do you think that the lack of understanding of the concept of sustainable economic growth leading to paralysis of indecision, do you think that's likely or possible? And if it does happen, would you see yourself having a role in intervening to move things forward?
Well, I think it's a fair question. I would hope that the work that the Short Life Working Group will do will provide a much greater degree of clarity as to the code itself and how to interpret these concepts. But clearly, I would have ongoing engagement, certainly with my own regulators that I engage with on a regular basis with the chief executives and the chairs of those organisations if they are having difficulty in interpreting our policy in any respect. And that would be a vehicle for us to have dialogue and say, well, okay, in relation to your specific functions as a regulator, what are the challenges to you in terms of delivering on this approach? And to sort of have a dialogue and interaction so we can give them better guidance, either through a formal letter of issuing sort of supplementary guidance on interpretation or just revising the code itself. I mean, I don't know whether that's something that's come up in discussion with Mr. Ewing, but that's certainly something I would be keen to do, and to not to be stand alone and aloof, but to have ongoing engagement with SEPA and SNH and make sure that if they were uncomfortable with anything, that we had a chance to interact on it and improve it if necessary.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Good morning. Just following on from the points raised by Alex Ferguson and Jane Baxter, in the event of a legal challenge in the courts on the concept of sustainable economic growth and the possibility of paralysis of indecision, as has been mentioned, was raised at the round table by Scottish Environmental Link. How will you ensure that the courts interpret the spirit of the law in the absence of national and international guidelines or definitions?
It's a very important point, and I know there obviously have been cases in recent time where accusations are made to SNH or SEPA that they have slowed down, if you like, the process of supporting an investment in a particular area or a particular industry, and as a kind of a, there's always a like a challenge for regulators when they're trying to do these things that protect the environment and also support legitimate and good economic investments. However, I think it's important to state we will provide guidance to support the delivery of the bill and its supporting secondary legislation to try and reduce the room for misinterpretation, and hopefully that will help the courts to interpret this as they see fit. I mean, it is obviously a matter for the courts to interpret law. We can't sort of directly influence the interpretation the court makes, but we can provide as much supporting information and guidance as to what the intent was behind the law, and to give us as much clarity as possible as to what our policy objectives were in promoting the legislation. I don't know whether George, from your knowledge of that area, would be able to explain how the courts would interpret that guidance.
Yes, I mean, certainly the courts would no doubt be looking at the provisions of the bill by then an act to look at what the requirements are. They would look, for instance, at the code of practice. If to take the hypothetical example, the case was about whether a particular regulator had or had not complied with that code of practice, they would obviously look at the code of practice. It is also possible in cases where the court is not clear from the statute or the code of practice what the purpose of it is, to look behind that to the proceedings, indeed the proceedings of this committee, at what was the intention of Parliament in putting that statute into place. So the courts can look behind just the words of the statute to discern what the purpose of the provision is.
Yeah, that's encouraging, Convener, that the code of practice, it's acknowledged that the code of practice should be robust enough for the courts to follow. So thank you for the feedback on that.
Very good. Yes, Nigel Don.
On that very point, and of course I wouldn't want for one moment to disagree with what Mr Burgess has just said, but I would put it to him and to the Minister that the last thing anybody wants to do is to produce an Act of Parliament that requires to be interpreted by the courts. The courts have to interpret statutes when they are forced to do so, but surely we would recognise it would be very much better to have a statute so well drafted and so absolutely clear that the courts never got involved.
It's an important point that Nigel Don raises, but I suppose the greatest scope there is for misinterpretation is around the difficult concepts that have formed the initial part of the discussion about sustainable development, sustainable economic growth. And these are concepts which are, if you like with the comfort zone, I would suggest, of most courts. So I think it will be helpful in providing as much guidance around those and how they should be interpreted and how they should be delivered by regulators, so that it assists the court in terms of what the intent was around concepts of sustainable development, sustainable economic growth.
I think that's my point entirely. Yeah. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah. But the fundamental point that you make about the legislation itself should be as clear as possible. I think that's an absolutely fair point.
Yeah. Okay.
Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. I can't resist the temptation to just say that so much of our time at the moment has been exercised by the Crofting Bill, and things having to be reinterpreted, very soon after that legislation going through. And I know there's lots of reasons for that, but I'm just very anxious that we don't find ourselves in that kind of scenario with this legislation in 2 or 3 times. So let's try and avoid any confusions of interpretation if we can possibly do that.
I can assure you I'm in 100% agreement with you on that point. As a recent student of Crofting law. Could I just highlight one point, Convener? I think it's in relation to one of the stakeholder comments that was made, and it was from Professor Colin Reader, who I know did have some criticisms of the bill, but so I'm not suggesting he's in 100% enthusiastic about everything there. But he did say, society, in respect to Law Society of Scotland, the society welcomes the Scottish Government's drive towards simplification of complex regulation and generally support the adoption of measures aimed to reduce inconsistency, streamline and clarify all and any environmental protection regimes. That's the intent we're trying to achieve, and I'm very happy that that's been recognised by Law Society of Scotland. I know there will be potential issues along the way, but believe me, I'm very keen to avoid a situation where we have a similar problem with decrofting.
Of course, the Crofting Bill has a court all of its own to deal with these things. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. As another recent student of Crofting Law, I couldn't agree with you more, Minister. And I do have still a concern, and I'm going to seek further reassurance if I can, about the fact that, as I understand it, there's going to be a short life working group, and there will be the possibility of looking at, am I understanding it right, there will be a possibility of looking at definitions as well as the criteria for sustainable economic growth. So how can we be sure that this statute itself, if we're going to continue to take it forward, which we are of course going to continue to take it forward, but without a definition, how can we be sure that the definition that will be come up with, that you know, by the working group is appropriate? It seems to me it should be, it's all the wrong way round.
I should be clear, sorry if I've confused matters. No, I may have confused in the way I've expressed it rather than it being your fault. There are existing definitions. I've sort of read out the one for sustainable economic growth. There may be one that people disagree with, but that's a definition that's there for it to be, to give guidance on how to interpret it. I think is the key. Sustainable development, as I understand, it's Environment Link, to pick up the point that was raised by Mr. Ferguson. Environment Link have suggested to me in the context of Environmental Link stakeholder meetings that the sustainable development definition that we already have in planning policy is one of the best they've seen. So therefore, I think there's widespread support for that definition, so I'm not proposing we change it or ask the working group to change it, but they can provide guidance to regulators about how to interpret it and just to give them support in terms of how to interpret that concept, which may not be something in all cases that we've talked about with Mr. Day. There are potentially those who regulate sectors that aren't familiar with these concepts in the same way as perhaps SEPA and SNH would be as to how to interpret them and get a consistency of interpretation across all regulators. I hope that clarifies the point. We're not talking about going back to the beginning and scrapping the definitions we already have. It's about trying to provide support and guidance to people as to how to interpret them in practice in their sector.
We're clear, I understand, just to wrap this up, that sustainable development is defined in the 1995 Act.
Not in the Act as I understand it, but maybe George can explain in relation to that particular Act. But there's a reference to sustainable development in the Act.
Yeah, I know.
But there is a definition of sustainable development in planning policy, which is one I know that Environment Link particularly respect and have actually used elsewhere.
Can we have that cited, please?
We can do indeed. We can give that to you.
Just so that we have it for our report.
If I may, just in relation to sustainable development, the term sustainable development is quite commonly used in statute. To my knowledge, there is no statutory definition anywhere in the UK of what that term means. There are, of course, commonly understood and accepted definitions, particularly going back to the Brundtland Commission from the early 1990s. So there is a common understanding, but you would not find a statutory definition of what the term means.
Well, maybe we need one in Scotland.
That's
It'd be world-beating, maybe. I think we could do with that, if you can help us in this regard, because I think we will find our way in our report from the views around this table to try and clarify these things, because the sustainable economic growth has been defined to a degree by the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, but we need to have a definition of sustainable development, which perhaps the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Environment might like to turn his attention to. Thank you. We move on to issues related to SNH, SEPA. Jim Hume.
Thank you, Convener. In Scotland, of course, we have several obligations, European and international, such as Natura sites, SSSIs and European protected species. Would you think that this duty to contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth could be used as a counter-justification for those who maybe want to develop and therefore perhaps inappropriate use of protected sites or impact, of course, on sustainable natural resources?
I understand the point that Mr. Hume is raising. I think I would refer back to the discussion about the hierarchy, and the duty does not prioritise sustainable economic growth over the other regulatory purposes So it's important to recognise, and I thank Mr Hume for raising it. It's an opportunity to put in the record. Regulators need to determine an appropriate balance, and that's a legitimate thing to do. But I think, as you've probably heard in evidence, they already make balancing judgments every day and are comfortable with that approach. So in terms of the initial comments I made about making the relationship to the government economic strategy more explicit, in introducing the public duty on sustainable economic growth, that helps provide the clarity, but it's something that regulators already have to do to strike a balance in terms of the environmental impacts and the sort of impact on sustainable economic growth. But being no doubt that the environmental, for SNH and SEPA, the environmental purpose is at the top of the hierarchy, and that is ultimately the first priority, and is formalising what other priorities then sit under that for the first time is what's been delivered by the duty. The natural assets that SNH and SEPA work to conserve and enhance are integral to sustainable economic growth, and I think that's why the development of our approach in terms of ecosystem services and indeed the natural capital index, which I referred to earlier, are so important, because they allow all policymakers to understand the economic value of protecting the environment so that they can see an economic return from protecting the environment, and it's not it's merely an add-on, it's actually integral to having a more sustainable approach to economic growth. And I hope that that's one area where there is a little bit of crossover between the two concepts. I think as we develop our understanding of ecosystem services, that if you like, the tools in the box for making decisions on these issues become stronger and help us make more rational decisions which support the protection of the environment but also support economic growth. And there's always tensions between the two, and I appreciate that. And indeed with the sort of social objectives that Claudia Beamish referred to early on. But these already exist now, and all of these are legitimate issues to take into account, and balancing judgments, as I say, are made every day by SNH and SEPA on these matters.
Yeah, thank you. Just maybe a small one, just to explore slightly deeper and putting protected sites to the side, but concentrating on SNH and SEPA. You said that both of them would put environment absolutely at the top, but this duty to contribute to achieve sustainable economic growth surely will still apply to them to some extent. So can you just maybe explore a bit further to what extent?
I suppose if we actually look at what's already happening, I think it's generally acknowledged that in recent years SEPA and SNH have taken a very much more kind of constructive approach and trying to work with those who have projects. And I'll give you a good there are good examples, I think, all over Scotland, but where SEPA and SNH are working with the promoters of a local project to ensure that development takes place in a way that's that delivers the economic benefit and the employment opportunities, but does not do harm where it can be avoided to the environment. And I recently visited Barra and visited a site which was a marine harvest site there, which is a finfish salmon farm offshore. And I'm aware there that SNH work very closely with Marine Harvest to identify, before they even put their application in, which areas would be of minimal concern to them in terms of the Sound of Barra that would be an appropriate place for a fish farm to be sited with minimal damage to the environment. So that kind of engagement with the developer to ensure that when they did come forward with an application, while other matters might be taken into account, they'd done as much as they possibly could prior to the application to minimise any environmental harm. And I think that's a good example of where the regulator can actually assist the process and ensure that a good project ultimately appears to have taken place, and avoid unnecessary conflict between the regulator and a developer by just talking to each other and ensuring that the information was available to them to make sure they chose a good site which was going to have minimal impact on the marine environment.
Thanks.
And Graham Day to follow on.
I'm happy with that answer.
You're happy with that. We've explored that in some considerable detail. Claudia Beamish.
Right, thank you. Convener, that's about the code of practice. Thank you very much. Apologies. Could I ask you, Minister, please, about the Code of Practice and how that will ensure that SNH and SEPA and FSA will be able to prioritise between the multiple statutory duties? Is this provision likely to change how regulators operate on a daily basis?
I suppose the way I would look at it is that provisions in the bill sort of place a duty on regulators to exercise their functions in a way that contributes to sustainable economic growth, but only to the extent that it would be consistent with the exercise of their other regulatory functions. So we're not asking them to do anything which would, and I think it sort of addresses the point Mr. Hume was making as well, we're not asking them to do anything that would subvert their existing regulatory functions, such as protecting the environment, which is obviously, as I say, at the top of the hierarchy. We're just saying, you can foresee scenarios whereby there might be projects which have potentially a similar economic impact, to take it the other way around, but one has a better environmental benefit, and therefore we clearly want always pick the one with a better environmental benefit, I would hope, as things stand already. But equally, where there's projects where there is a similar environmental impact, positive or negative, that they would now be empowered to take account of the economic impact and choose the one which had formally empowered to do that, to take the one that had the biggest employment and social impact as well. So it's just balancing things up, but to be absolutely clear, we would not want and do not intend that by introducing this public duty in terms of sustainable economic growth, that would in any way subvert the existing regulatory duties that SEPA and SNH have. They must be at the top of the hierarchy, and therefore, it's only when there's no conflict there, in the sense that wouldn't subvert that principle, that they can then take economic impact into account. I don't know if that answers the point, but I think it's important to recognise that SEPA is not subject to the Part 1 duty. And the duty in respect of sustainable economic growth does not apply where a regulator is already subject to a duty to the same effect as well, which is an issue I think that needs to be taken into account. But my main point really is that we would not do anything that would subvert the original public duty on the part of the regulator in respect of the environmental protection, for example.
And Minister, in relation to the FSA, would you have any specific comments about that?
Well, FSA is out with my day-to-day duties, but I maybe if I could refer to Neil Watt, if you've had any discussions in regard to FSA and interaction in that respect.
I think that the FSA and SNH both gave evidence last week about the sort of, how this might work in practice. I don't think I could sort of tell it better myself.
Okay, just to clarify a point about the duty of SNH and SEPA to contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth, does that duty, applying to those two bodies' roles as statutory consultees in the planning process, have a conflict of interest?
It only applies to the regulatory functions. Sorry, Minister.
Okay.
You have your answer. But I suppose as a minister with portfolio responsibility for SNH and SEPA, I would just note, I know SEPA and SNH do come under sometimes a lot of pressure in respect of important economic projects, but they are fulfilling their statutory duties to protect the environment, and I think it's an important function that people need to recognise. Those who are applying for projects can greatly assist by ensuring they have the appropriate information and do the appropriate evidence gathering as well to support that process. Quite often the difficulties arise because there's insufficient information provided in support of an application, not because of a lack of willingness on the part of SNH or SEPA to consider the application. But it's important to recognise that those agencies are there for a reason, to protect and conserve the natural environment and protect the environment from environmental harms, and that is their overriding purpose. But they do, I think, through this bill, get a better line of sight with other government policy in terms of the sustainable economic growth agenda, and where it's appropriate to take those matters into account in the decision. But I would not ask them to do anything inappropriate in response to their primary statutory duties.
That's very useful. I want to move on to part 2 in chapter 1 on environmental regulation. Nigel Don.
Thank you very much, Convener. The part 2, of course, largely covers SEPA, and it talks about controlled activities one way or another. Dr. Sarah Hendry, in her written evidence, made a point about the 4 sorts of control which appear to be there of a permit, registration, notification and general binding rules. And she made the point, which I think I understand, that permits and general binding rules are things that we know about historically. It wasn't entirely clear what the difference between a registration and a notification might be. And I think, if I may say so, my question is not necessarily a terribly technical one. Do we need two different things called registration and notification? Could we not just have permits, general binding rules, and something else in between? Would a three-tier system actually be adequate? I think is probably the first question.
Yeah, I mean, I take the point. Schedule 2, as you quite rightly identified, provides for a sort of four-tier system of authorisations, should that be required. The permit and registration are similar in terms of their legal effect. The notifications intended to be used as a means of an operator simply telling SEPA that you're carrying out an activity in a particular location. It's most likely used to be combined with a general binding rule, so that there is a requirement on the operator both to follow the rules set out in the legislation or guidance and to notify SEPA that they are carrying out the activity. And the Water Scotland Services Act 2003 also provides for 4 similar tiers, so there is already a similar approach being deployed. But I take the point, that making clear why that's necessary is maybe something we could do a little bit more on. But I don't know if George wants to comment on the existing operation of a similar 4-tier approach.
Yes, I think a couple of points. First of all, remember, what we're providing here is simply an enabling power. How many tiers are used in an individual bit of regulation would be a matter for the regulations themselves. And I think I would certainly take the point that 4 is probably too many. It's certainly a matter that we've discussed quite a lot amongst ourselves and with the lawyers as to whether 3 was sufficient. The permit, the registration and the general binding rule. We thought it was best to retain the flexibility that's already there from the Water Environment Water Services Scotland Act 2003, although in the practice down the line and in consultation with regulated parties, it may be that the regulations that are produced only actually make use of a subset of the flexibility that's available there.
Okay, I think I'm now understanding that. So notification might just be an add-on to a general binding rule process, and registration might indeed be a subset of a permit. Yeah, okay. I think if these already exist elsewhere and they will be mixed and matched, I suspect that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to Chapter 2 and Powers of Enforcement, mainly related to SEPA. Angus MacDonald to kick off, please.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I was pleased to hear, Minister, in your introductory remarks that environmental workshops will be held next week with stakeholders, and no doubt these workshops will be looking at powers of enforcement. So if I could turn to the greater powers of enforcement, which are going to give SEPA powers such as fixed monetary penalties, variable monetary penalties, non-compliance penalties and cost recovery, which I, as a constituency member, very much welcome, given that there are a number of waste management issues within my constituency. However, I was wondering if you are confident, Minister, that SEPA has the ability to fairly determine the balance of probability in relation to proving that an offence has taken place.
In short, yes, we are confident there are adequate sort of safeguards in place to protect, I suppose, those that are being accused of offences, and ensuring that there's sort of a proportional approach. I think evidence has been given by Bridget Marshall on the reasons for applying a balance of probabilities test to the evidence that SEPA must gather, and obviously I know that there may be some interest in the relationship in terms of the criminal versus the civil actions and where the boundary falls, and clearly we sort of have a role for Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service to determine whether on the balance of probability something criminal has undertaken something that's been quite malicious and deliberate and is not simply a case of someone being a sort of a non-complier, maybe through ignorance of their requirements. the reasons are around sort of distinguishing the role, Procurator Fiscal, and the role of SEPA in terms of the Scottish system. We're looking at other enforcement measures that SEPA can take, such as imposing an enforcement notice, which we've got some responses about, and making sure that these new enforcement measures sit alongside existing measures as well. Looking at other civil penalty systems that SEPA is responsible for, such as under emissions trading, which is an area where we already have responsibility there, and looking at other regulators that impose discretionary civil penalties. There is an issue, as I'm sure you're aware, in terms of ECHR and Article 6, and an important factor is the Independent Appeal Tribunal, which we'll also be providing, which is another safeguard as well, which we've recognised in the bill the need to keep that independent of ministers so that there can be an objective decision.
So you are confident that SEPA's powers of enforcement will be proportionate?
Yeah, I mean, proportionality is a key part of the bill, and alongside transparency and other issues when it comes to enforcement. I suppose I've already seen in the short time I've been in this role quite a difference between someone who's an accidental non-complier versus, as we know, and I think I've addressed to the committee previously, we know there are some serious organised crime elements involved with some aspects of the waste sector. I'm not linking it to, just to be clear, I'm not linking it to the constituency members' constituency, but there are issues in relation to other sites which, and I've visited one recently where near IKEA, where there was a horrendous site left behind by a waste contractor who's clearly breached the regulations in quite a significant way and left effectively a huge cost to clear up that site. So we need to have the powers that allow us to tackle these kind of sites, and currently SEPA are really trying to do that with one arm tied behind their back. They have very limited powers, very modest fines and fixed penalties that they can apply, and we need to have a system which is more proportionate to reflect cases where there's quite serious intent to ignore regulations or to do something of a criminal nature, and to have a system which also reflects that sometimes things happen because people are just ignorant of the regulations that they have to work within.
If I recall correctly, I think there was comment made at committee that there was a possibility of bonds being put in place for any new waste management developments that were happening. So that would certainly help when it comes to people who don't follow the rules. Can you advise, Minister, what discussions have taken place with SEPA on these general matters of extra powers of enforcement?
If I could maybe address that to Neil and Bridget as to the ongoing engagement, because I know they're both very actively involved with discussions with SEPA on the content of the bill, but also the wider enforcement issues.
We are obviously in very active discussions with SEPA, and part of the role of me being seconded into Scottish Government is ensuring that that link is as strong as possible. The other very important partner in all of this is the Crown Office and the Lord Advocate. There have been discussions between the Minister and the Lord Advocate around how in practice these enforcement tools will work, and exploring very carefully the territory between the role of the Procurator Fiscal and the role of SEPA. So there are very active discussions going on amongst all the parties involved in this quite novel use of tools for SEPA.
And the event, if I may, Convener, the event next week is I guess, jointly hosted by SEPA, Scottish Government and Crown Office. I mean, we're all there to basically answer the questions from all angles and try and explain if required on how this will actually work in practice and the impacts for people, and of course the intention behind it all.
On the intent, can we just add one point, because I'm conscious of time passing. The whole system, I should stress, and I think Bridget Marshall has just referred to Lord Advocate, the whole system will operate within the framework of the Lord Advocate's guidelines, which will set out in terms of proportionality and public interest, those cases which were referred to the Procurator Fiscal for prosecution, and those cases that SEPA will apply enforcement measures directly to. So I think clarity will be there as to where the boundary lies, and hopefully the event next week will help inform that.
Thank you. Dick Lyle, please.
Yes, Minister. Can I follow on with the point that actually was well made by Angus MacDonald in regards to people who do dump or people who do cause problems? And for the whole of my political life, I abhor people who lease sites or dump or whatever, and continually, want these people taken up. But the fact is, again, when you read your papers and you're on about criminals, and you say, well, why did that criminal not get the full letter of the law? Why didn't the judge or the SEPA hit them with a bigger fine? So what's the justification for setting the cap on fixed monetary penalties at only £40,000?
Well, that cap, the £40,000 cap, was chosen after detailed consideration, and it is the maximum amount that can be imposed by a criminal court in a summary proceedings for most environmental offences. Policy intention is not to create an imbalance between the criminal courts, so that £40,000 seem to be an appropriate upper limit. It's worth bearing in mind that clearly where the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service determined that there's been a really serious crime and there's serious criminal intent, that will be treated, it wouldn't go through necessarily through summary procedure, it would go to the criminal courts. It would be heard in full and evidence taken, and potentially more severe penalties applied by the courts in those situations. So we're not saying that's the absolute maximum limit, but it's the maximum that can be set for summary proceedings, and that's to try and, if you like, acknowledge that there may be an interest in the public interest, not necessarily in dealing with things quickly, getting it tackled quickly, rather than having a huge delay and ultimately coming out with the same conclusion ultimately about the level of fine. But I don't know whether, Bridget, you want to add anything to that in terms of the approach to be taken in the criminal court if it was to go to court, and what the kind of penalties might be in that scenario.
Just for clarity, the £40,000 relates to the variable monetary penalty, which is something that SEPA will be able to impose directly. So that's why the cap is at £40,000. And as the Minister rightly said, that's the maximum for most environmental offences on summary proceedings, which is, for the less serious crime. A serious crime will be taken to a jury trial on solemn proceedings, and there it's an unlimited fine and imprisonment. So it's important to have in mind that the line of 40,000 is around the penalties that SEPA can impose directly, and anything more significant will be referred as currently through to the fiscals for a prosecution in the criminal courts, either on summary or of more serious solemn procedure.
I'm certainly glad to hear that, and criminals beware. Thank you.
Okay, Alec Ferguson, the Procurator Fiscal.
Indeed, thank you, Convener. In oral evidence that's been given to us, both the Law Society of Scotland and indeed the UK Environmental Law Association raised concerns about the implications of enforcement measures being imposed by SEPA based on basically the balance of probabilities as against court procedures when the standard is based on, has to be beyond reasonable doubt, and they raised a sort of issue over what could be seen as a sort of lower level of evidence, if I can put it as bluntly as that. So really what I want to ask is what approach do you see SEPA adopting in deciding whether to go for the fixed or variable fine based on a balance of probabilities, as opposed to passing it on to Procurator Fiscal, bringing with it a greater burden of proof? And I just wonder whether you could expand on that for us.
Well, I suppose there's a number of issues there. I mean, I do recognise that there will always be concerns in this area, and I know there's been substantial sort of feedback through the consultation and the evidence you heard last week on these sort of matters. It's important to say, in terms of how the Procurator Fiscal would be satisfied on the balance of probabilities, and therefore, the approach that would then be taken, that the person has committed a relevant offence. There are a number of safeguards built into the system, including the Lord Advocate's guidelines as referred to earlier on, which will set the framework for the new enforcement measures. SEPA will then revise its enforcement policy to include the new enforcement measures, so that there will be a linkage between the two. SEPA is required by the legislation to provide detailed guidance about the new enforcement measures and how they will apply, so there's clarity for those obviously who would be trying to avoid committing an offence, but as to how it would apply to them in that situation. And in most cases, apart from the purely administrative type of offences, SEPA will, as a matter of practicality, carry out an investigation for offences, and only at quite a later stage will the evidence be available to assess whether this is a significant or less significant case. I mean, I do recognise the need that, to ensure that there's appropriate evidential trail to support any prosecution of an offence by either SEPA or by the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service. But the evidence available will not dictate whether the case will be referred to the Procurator Fiscal or dealt with directly, and this will be determined by the Lord Advocate's guidance, or guidelines I should say, and the nature of the offence itself, and whether there's been a criminal intent involved as determined by probabilities. Callum MacDonald, who's SEPA's Executive Director, gave evidence about the training that will be given to officers as well, and the robust national governance arrangements which will ensure that decisions around the new enforcement measures are scrutinised at an appropriate level within an organisation, are consistent, so that there's ongoing monitoring, if you like, of how these are being delivered in practice. So if any problems do emerge in terms of inconsistency of approach, that those are tackled and rectified. I don't know whether that's answered the question.
Well, I think it has to a certain degree. I think it's obviously incredibly important, I think, to get this bit right, because if there is room for doubt in this, then presumably SEPA could be open to accusations of saying, well, we haven't got enough proof to get it through the courts, but we'll do them through the powers we have ourselves. And that's obviously not something one wants to see.
I think the important point is that if you like, the evidence, the quality of evidence isn't what will determine whether it goes to the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service or whether it's dealt with by SEPA. It's more that is there on the balance of probabilities, is it likely that a criminal intent was involved, and regardless of the quality of the evidence, that would then go to the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service, as I understand it, under the Lord Advocate's guidelines. But if clearly there was just a regulated non-compliance, it was accidental or incompetence in some respect, then there's no criminal intent, and it'd be more likely to be dealt with through SEPA directly taking enforcement action. I don't know whether that's consistent with what Bridget's understanding is, but maybe I could ask her to confirm that.
I think I gave quite a lot of evidence before the committee 2 weeks ago about why we chose the burden of proof as civil, and the ministers referred to that. And I think in practice, I acknowledged that was a criticism that could be levied in relation to the approach that we've chosen. But I think the Minister has outlined some of the safeguards in his answer as to why that is unlikely to happen or virtually impossible to happen. And I think the framework that the Lord Advocate will put in place, it will make it very difficult in practice for SEPA to put its weaker cases through its own direct measures rather than referring them through to the fiscals. And the really important point is that the amount of evidence that is available, the sufficiency of evidence, is not going to dictate the route that these offences will take through the new system.
I'll just finally ask on that point, will the Lord Advocate's guidelines be made public? Will we have access to knowing what those guidelines are? And if possible, when will they be in place?
Well, they will be, and the workshop next week, which is focusing on enforcement, is a joint workshop with Scottish Government, SEPA and the Crown Office, and the guidelines will be discussed at that workshop and will be made public subsequently.
That's very useful to us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And following on, Jane Baxter, please.
Just following on that point, but from a different perspective, is it possible that someone who's been served with a notice of intent could sort of say to themselves, well, I'll take my chances in the court, I'll ask to be referred to the court, because then there's more need to demonstrate proof in the court than the balance of probabilities? Would it be, is there any chance of the perpetrator being offered that choice?
I'm certainly aware of comparable systems where somebody has a parking offence or a speeding offence where they can either choose to take the punishment or go to court, and that is obviously deployed elsewhere in the system. So I appreciate the point you're making, that there are sort of issues there, and I believe that model was initially sort of considered to sort of give a similar approach, but the principle of proportionality was felt to be important here, and if we did follow that kind of approach, some of the less significant cases could still be referred to the criminal system, and in many cases this would be, in our view, disproportionate and reduce the benefits in terms of speed, cost, and removing this type of case from the criminal justice system altogether, where it's felt to be appropriate. The appeal system, of course, is still relevant here, and it's crucial to ensuring compliance with Article 6 as well, so that someone who's unhappy could still appeal, and one of the measures in the bill is to remove that appeal from ministers, so there's not felt to be an undue balance in favour of perhaps SEPA, and it's at least on a temporary basis to put it to Land Court, for Land Court to hear those sort of appeals, and that's felt to be consistent with Article 6 of the ECHR as well, so it's an important measure. But I take the point, but the proportionality was felt to be important, and to avoid unnecessarily bogging down the criminal justice system with cases which were relatively minor and not of a criminal intent, we decided to go down a different route.
And if there was a successful appeal against a notice, would that preclude SEPA from being able to pursue further action in the form of a second notice or a prosecution?
I might ask Bridget to come in this one, but my understanding is where a fixed penalty is withdrawn by the tribunal, SEPA cannot have another go. And at that point, the final notice is served for either a fixed or variable penalty. So at the point that a final notice is served for either a fixed penalty or a variable penalty, then in relation to the facts which constituted the offence, no further sanction can be imposed by SEPA, nor can the case be referred to the Procurator Fiscal for a prosecution. So that's effectively it. There's no kind of double jeopardy or whatever, but I don't know if Bridget could just... yeah, indeed. I don't know if Bridget can just confirm that that's correct. That would be helpful.
No, that is correct. And for continuing offences, if the facts arise again, then at that point SEPA can either impose another variable penalty that might be higher, or decide at that point that because there's a continuing course of offending, that they will refer it through to the Procurator Fiscal for a report. So it's in relation to that particular set of facts that the first notice was served in relation to.
We're stating, just as a general approach, that, and I think this is a point that's been raised by with the NFU as well, that we are trying to take a kind of targeted approach to target our efforts on those who are serious, regular offenders in either a criminal nature or just serial non-compliers, as part of the general package of measures to try and target SEPA's resources more effectively. But in terms of NFUS, there was one instance where I'm aware that there was a catchment which had a serious problem with diffuse pollution. On investigation, there were 5,000 breaches of regulations within that catchment. But SEPA worked with NFUS and local farming community and others to raise awareness of the non-compliance issues, the importance of tackling diffuse pollution. Repeat visits were undertaken, and now 75% of farmers have taken remedial action and are complying. So where we can, we'll use SEPA's enforcement action and the risk of it, from the point of view of the farmer or the non-complier, but to try and encourage them to comply first, and when they consistently don't comply, then we target the resources on prosecution. But the first approach is to try and get people to comply in the first place and avoid them getting embroiled unnecessarily in the criminal justice system, or indeed in terms of getting direct action from SEPA.
Supplementary point on there, Graham Day.
Minister, what about the regular, relatively trivial offenders? The company that owns multiple sites and across the range of sites is guilty of a series of misdemeanours, but they're genuinely quite small fry. Should we not be looking at the cumulative situation here and sending out a message that if you have a bad attitude to environmental regulation, that you will be pursued?
Well, I wholly endorse that approach. I think we obviously up to now we've probably been talking about a situation where somebody's doing a serious breach versus somebody's doing one isolated minor breach, or indeed a small number of breaches on one site. And I think it's a fair point to raise. There are people who maybe have a turn the other cheek kind of attitude and just turn a blind eye to a series of fairly low-grade environmental breaches, things like littering, that kind of stuff, which can add up to a serious problem and over the entire estate that they have. And I think it's entirely right that we would have engagement with SEPA to highlight that they were they aware across all of their sites that they had this problem. They may not be aware that it's happening everywhere, just due to the management structure within the company. Give them the chance to comply. If they fail to comply, then obviously we'd look to SEPA to try and take enforcement action. But I don't know whether there's been a specific discussion in those scenarios in the build-up to the bill that maybe Neil or Bridget can refer to.
Yes, and this was raised at committee last time in front of Callum MacDonald, and I think he gave assurances that we are beginning to look across sectors, but also across corporate entities, particularly in the way in which we're organising our inspection and audit. So that might be done on a corporate basis rather than being done on the individual companies within a particular corporation, and that there are measures in the bill or the regulations that will come under the bill which will allow SEPA to look at perhaps corporate permitting, so that we can look at issues on a company-wide basis rather than just looking at the individual sites.
It's worth stressing that those company executives that are responsible for a large chain of companies would be accountable, for the actions of their subordinates and across the network. So I think it's just making them aware that they are in breach, and encourage them as accountable officers to ensure they bring their company in within the regulations.
I mean, you're quite right. We were given that assurance by SEPA, but it was good to get the Minister's enthusiasm for tackling this issue on the record, so thank you.
Very good. Dick Lyle?
I'm very impressed with the fact that you're going to have a common sense approach by SEPA and yourself in regards to people who unintentionally break the law, but have broke the law, at the end of the day. But I want you to go after the people who are continually breaking the law and who are basically, casting a blind eye and thinking they're getting away with it. But again, we'll turn to the appeal process. Would the appeal processes as set out in the bill add to current ad hoc approach for dealing with environmental appeals, rather than support a move to a more strategic approach for dealing with environmental appeals?
It's a fair point, and appeals against technical decisions that are made by SEPA are usually heard by Scottish ministers, and I'm aware of the concern that's been expressed in the consultation. I suppose it's a good example of where we've been listening to those consultation responses, and I've taken the approach that, at least in the interim, until we know the outcome of other discussions around future tribunals in Scotland, that we will have an appeal to a body which is wholly independent of Scottish ministers. And the Tribunals Bill is obviously following a similar timetable to this bill, and we intend to set the appropriate tribunal in regulations at a future point, which will be able to sort of position to identify the most appropriate appeals route, once we know the landscape, if you like, of the tribunals with the new tribunal system for Scotland. The Tribunal Bill, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to highlight it, is an important part of improving the current landscape, and we undertake a range of ambitious and significant reforms to the justice system, which I'm sure members are aware of. The implementation of Lord Gill's Scottish Civil Courts Review will also pave the way for swifter handling of cases, we hope, including the public interest cases such as environmental cases. And a new tribunal structure will allow in time for certain specialist civil chambers to be set up within it. So I appreciate it would appear a bit ad hoc at the moment, but I suppose the assurance I want to give you is that we're aware of the Tribunal Bill, the fact the landscape of tribunals will itself change. We can't, at this point in time, when this bill is having to go through Parliament at the same time as the Tribunal Bill, prejudge what the outcome of that tribunal review will be, but that we will look for the suitable, most appropriate tribunal in which to take these cases, to maintain that independence of decision from Scottish ministers, to recognise the concern that's been made by stakeholders about the need for that to be heard in an objective forum, and to maintain that principle.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Before I do go to my question, can I just add a comment regarding the common sense approach, which has been mentioned in this section. NFUS have welcomed at this committee on more than one occasion a more collaborative approach by SEPA towards Scotland's farmers, and that certainly has to be welcomed. If I could turn to entry and search powers, Minister, can you provide more detail on potential future amendments to entry and search powers under the Environment Act 1995? Have these been consulted on, and how will these better equip SEPA to tackle environmental crime?
Absolutely. I'll try and give a bit of clarity if at all possible. I'm sure members are aware of the Environmental Crime Task Force, which has been established by the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Environment. And that task force is a group of experts, including SEPA, Scottish Government, the police and the Crown Office, and it's tasked with supporting the delivery of Scottish Government's commitment to tackling environmental crime. And they are due to report in July of this year. Hopefully that will provide some greater clarity on the point. We understand the report will include proposed amendments to entry and search powers for SEPA under the Environment Act 1995 to make them more fit for purpose for tackling environmental crime rather than looking at compliance issues. And I would like to just pick up a point that Mr. Lyle was making, and indeed you refer to yourself, Mr. MacDonald, in relation to the kind of proportionality of the approach and targeting. I'm aware, and I think I've mentioned it before, the site in Lonehead that I went to visit, but there are others where serious threats of violence were made to SEPA staff, and I find that totally unacceptable, and I'm sure the committee would as well. We need to really provide, things have been so imbalanced, it's been difficult for SEPA officers to gain entry to sites to investigate issues of non-compliance, often in the face of physical threats, sometimes stalking, sometimes intimidation, out with their day-to-day work, so people are actually targeting their families, themselves, using social media. There's a lot of very aggressive behaviour going on, and I think we really need to rebalance the situation so that our guys, if I can put it that way, have got the tools to do the job and not face unreasonable threats in carrying out their duties.
Thank you. Moving on to certainly I would agree that any intimidation of SEPA officers is absolutely, totally, completely out of order, and the sooner they have powers to address that, the better. Moving on to the National Litter Strategy, can you provide more detail on the National Litter Strategy and the potential for new powers for public bodies, other than SEPA, to issue fixed penalty notices?
If I may, only at this point in time, without stealing the Cabinet Secretary's thunder, just to confirm there shortly will be a Scottish Government consultation National Litter Strategy, which will do exactly what the member has asked in terms of looking at issues to do with fixed penalty notices and looking at the future. That is likely to take place over the summer, so we do not have long to wait. It's a very high priority for the Cabinet Secretary, who's very keen to see a more concerted effort taken on all forms of littering in Scotland, and I would hope this bill supports it, but those measures specifically relating to the National Litter Strategy will be set out in the consultation, and hopefully have an opportunity to feed into that in due course.
Okay, if that's been announced over the summer, it'd be helpful if it could be circulated to committee over the summer.
I'm sure it will,
so
as a matter of course, but we'll make sure that's noted, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to Chapter 3, Court Powers. Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, what considerations would a court be required to take into account in deciding whether it was appropriate to issue a publicity order? For example, would the fact the offence was accidental be a consideration? Or, as the FSB suggested, if a small business lacked understanding of their responsibilities? Would publicity orders be confined only to very serious offences where perhaps the perpetrator had quite deliberately played fast and loose with the environment? Or would past misdemeanours be considered where a company had been guilty of a whole series of relatively minor breaches, eventually be subject to an order on the basis of enough's enough?
It's a very, very good question, and I'm grateful for the chance to clarify. I mean, the policy intent is that publicity orders will only be used for the most serious and deliberate breaches of environmental legislation. It is an additional sentencing power to be given to the criminal courts. It will be, however, be up to the courts' discretion as to how they use such a sentencing option, but I do make clear that it's our intent that it would be only used for the most serious and deliberate breaches of environmental legislation. However, I suppose it's to pick up the point that the member makes about whether there's a series of non-compliance. If that, obviously there's ongoing notification that breaches are taking place and they're consistently being ignored, then it's open to interpretation that's deliberate and with intent. So we'll need to sort of, I suppose, clarify at what point it becomes a serious offence to continually ignore such issues and to allow non-compliance to get to that stage. But we do have to have a proportionate approach recognise the point that you made, Deputy Convener, about those who are maybe just a bit daft and not paid attention to what their responsibilities are, versus those who are seriously seeking to subvert the environmental regulations that they're duty bound to operate within, and are doing it with clear intent. And that would be where we would seek to see publicity orders, hopefully embarrassing them into action.
Thank you. Because clearly the publicity orders have a role in this as a deterrent. The damage has been done, but as a deterrent to the individuals concerned not to do it again, and to other companies who see what happens if you are guilty of such mistakes.
Huge potential for, obviously, for reputational damage for a company, and that is operating elsewhere. I believe it's Australia, I think, that it's already being used, and it has apparently had an impact. And you know, the aim is to deter the actions in the first place, which damage the environment and undermine legitimate businesses. And I think legitimate businesses will take these matters very seriously, and it will act as a deterrent. You know, so I'm hopeful that we do need to use this power often, because the mere threat of it being there will deter those actions in the first place.
One final point, if I may, Convener. And will guidance be given to the courts as to what would be deemed to be a serious offence?
I think that's a reasonable point, and I would imagine there would be clear guidance on what the intent is. But ultimately, it would be the discretion of the courts, but I believe guidelines would be produced.
It's not a matter on which government would ever seek to guide the courts. There will be opportunities in the court for the Procurator Fiscal or the Advocate Depute to perhaps draw the publicity order provisions to the court's attention, but sentencing is a matter for the courts, and not one that the government would ever seek to provide guidance to the courts on how to use their powers.
I think, to pick up on the Deputy Convener's point, I think where we probably do need to be clear is where the policy intent is, and to set out, if you like, what our understanding would be of the policy and where it would apply. But ultimately, the discretion, as George Burgess has said, is up to the court as to when they apply it.
Thank you for that.
Very good. We're going to move on to Chapter 4 and some miscellaneous provisions. I think Nigel Don has a question.
Convener, some miscellaneous things, and possibly in a fairly random order. I wonder if I could start by simply asking whether the Minister feels he wants to say any more about possible amendments relating to contaminated land.
Is there any particular concern that you have?
No, well, my understanding from your letter, I think, is that you were proposing maybe to bring amendments at stage 2. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the contaminated land provisions, which included the Environmental Protection Act 1990 Part 2A, are extremely technical, and we recognise that. We think we've got the provisions right on contaminated land sites, but we do need to make a few amendments to the provisions around special sites to reflect the role of SEPA and the local authorities on those special sites. So there are some particular adjustments that have to be made, but I do apologise, it's a hugely technical area, and I appreciate that, but hopefully we can keep those sort of amendments to the minimum necessary.
So we look forward to seeing that at stage 2?
Yes, indeed.
I think that's fine. Okay, thank you. I just wondered whether there was anything we should add there. I'm wondering if I then come back to the general principle of vicarious liability and the extent of that, please. One question that has been asked is whether or not it might refer to trusts. Quite a lot of our land is held in trust. Do we have any detail on what that is intended to cover, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important point that you raise, Mr. Don. I mean, the vicarious liability provisions as set in the bill do apply to non-natural legal persons, so a company and partnership, not individuals or sole traders. Intention is that it includes any legal person, to use the vernacular, other than an individual. So will potentially extend to unincorporated associations or bodies of persons, including trusts. But obviously, clearly, if the committee has any concerns about the need to sort of clarify these matters, we can happily do that.
I think the reference to trust comes in fact as no surprise at all. I think unincorporated associations might well raise a few eyebrows, because by definition those things tend to sort of appear and people don't realise they're part of it. And
yeah,
I just wonder how much consideration has been given to that, please.
At the end of the day, it applies, as the Minister says, to anything that the law recognises as being a legal personality. So if a particular unincorporated association does in law have a legal personality, it is caught by these provisions. If it's a looser association that is not in law a legal person, the provisions don't apply. Key point is, it would only be a legal person that would be able to have a license or permit from SEPA in the first place. So if the thing exists as a legal entity, the vicarious liability provisions will apply to it.
Thank you. And then I wonder if I could just pick up on the offences themselves on the issue of environmental harm, which I think is defined and understood elsewhere in statute. What's not clear to me is whether significant environment harm is also understood in law.
There are a number of existing regulatory offences under Controlled Activities Regulations 2011, the Environmental Protection Act 1990, the Pollution Prevention and Control Regulations 2012, and indeed the Radioactive Substances Act of 1993. The intention is to repeal these offence provisions and provide a single set of regulatory offences under the new integrated regulatory framework. So it's a good example, I suppose, of where we're seeking to simplify and improve the read across of regulation. Regulatory offences include the failure to have an authorisation or failing to comply with a condition of the permit, for example, and that's would appear certainly in respect to the waste sector, for example, the failure to comply with the conditions is a major concern, as we saw very recently in terms of a large site containing tyres in Lanarkshire. In addition, there will be the new significant environmental harm offence, which will apply where the harm caused is outside that contemplated by the regulatory system, whether the offender has a permit or not. And the examples that they've given, I think, have been in relation to the health and well-being of the Scottish population and protecting and improving the environment. So, so they're not specifically specified in regulation, but clearly you can define instances where a harm has been committed to the health and well-being of the public, which is obviously a major concern for government and indeed the whole Parliament, and indeed protecting and improving the environment. The provision of the bill will bring SEPA's purpose in line with Scottish Government's purpose, of course, as we set out earlier, and help demonstrate the environment and the economy are mutually supportive objectives as well. So there is a side benefit of doing it in this way. So, George,
if I might, just to pick up on your specific question about, is significant environmental harm a clearly understood concept? If we look at section 31 of the bill, it itself sets out when environmental harm becomes significant environmental harm, and that's defined about serious adverse effects locally, nationally, or indeed on a wider scale. So you can imagine a sort of harm that is very isolated locally, but is very significant because of what has happened in that place. There is also provision there that we can recognise harm done to a particular area, so a Natura site or somewhere like that, if it's one that is designated by ministers. So we're trying to give, I think, as clear a signal as we can of when a environmental harm would be denoted as significant.
I'm grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that takes us to the end of these series of questions just now. You've given us a lot of material to think about for our report. Thank you very much, Minister, and your officials for that highly detailed and interesting set of evidence. And we'll end this agenda item here and move on to agenda item 3. Agenda item 3 is related to our annual report, which we need to consider for the parliamentary year 11th May 2012 to 10th May 2013. And I refer members to the paper provided, and I intend to go through it page by page. So on page 1 of the draft annual report, are there any comments about alterations related to introduction or the legislation that we've dealt with? And of course, as you know, we're still in public, so if anyone has any comments, they're on the record. That's why you're all so quiet. Yep.
I don't have a problem with the content, but I was just wondering if Twitter should have a capital T.
These are the kinds of questions which we should be asking, but I do think it should have a capital T. Anything else on page 1? Some more legislation on page 2 and sublege, followed by inquiries and evidence sessions, which then spill over onto page 3.
16 at the bottom of page 2. I did report back to the committee, so I think it's useful just to see and reported to the committee.
Okay.
Several points of...
We can frame that
yes.
context, yes, and report it to the committee. Very good. And over on to page 3. Any points there? At the bottom, we look at petitions that we've had a look at, which flows over onto page 4, some of which are open, one of which is closed. And on to page 4, engagement and innovation. Happy with that. And then equalities. Happy with that. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. I'm just wondering the extent to which our responsibilities as a committee in relation to the 9 protected characteristics are sort of clearly identified in the report, in that we certainly looked at it in relation to the budget and had discussion about that, but I'm wondering the extent to which they are actually identified in relation to our brief rural Scotland.
Are you suggesting where they should be, this could possibly be inserted?
I think I'm just wondering whether there might be some identification of issues that have come up within those characteristics.
Examples, for example.
Yes, during the year, just to make it a little more robust.
Do we have any practical examples we can think of at the moment?
Well, if we think of some of the protected characteristics, it might help to sort of to see if other committee members can think about how we've looked at those issues, which we have a responsibility to do. I mean, such as disability or age or gender. Nobody else is
Seemingly saying anything. They're welcome to at the moment. Alec Ferguson.
That while I absolutely understand where Claudia Beamish is coming from here, I think that in a report of this nature, it should be, or given the remit of the committee and what we have to fulfil under our obligations, where it should be drawn to attention in a report is if we significantly fail to pay due attention to what is within our remit, rather than to highlight every example of where we don't. So I think it should, given the fact that we are expected to comply with all of this, it should be taken as read that we do so, unless somebody wishes to point out somewhere where we don't. And I think I would find it more helpful if we came from that perspective, rather than highlighted, because it's taken as read that we do comply with these measures. And I think the report should be left the way it is, rather than that. I'm open to argument, but that's where I would come from.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I understand what Alex Ferguson, what you're saying, but I do think that as there's an obligation on us, that I wouldn't agree that it should just be taken as read. It's something that we as a committee do need to be checking whether we have looked at those 9 protected characteristics, because we have an obligation under the Equalities Act.
Well, this is reporting in what we've actually done, and therefore we shouldn't be looking to add to it unless, there's something very significant. And I take Alec Ferguson's point, if we feel that we've been negligent, I'm sure that we'd be able to bring that up. We're trying to, close this into an area where we do perform correctly. And if we haven't, then I think members should draw that to our attention at the appropriate time. Dick Lyle first.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Alec Ferguson. I think, if you look through this whole report, including the good work done by Mr. Hume, basically on our behalf, and I'm sure he isn't listening to me. Basically, the fact is that if you look at the whole range, it's been a very exciting year, and all the bills that we've done, the visits that were made. Unfortunately, some of the visits I couldn't do, although I was on the first one, and all the going through all the various. And I take the point that Claudia Beamish is making, but I'd like her to highlight what exactly she would want added to the report. I think it's an excellent report, and it shows well how well this committee has worked in the last year. And I would compliment the convener on his stewardship and also the members on the work that they've done.
That's very kind of you. We can't add to this report unless we have specific examples that Claudia Beamish mentions in relation to the 9 protected characteristics. So I think we should, leave this at the moment as it is as a report, and bear that in mind for any future. That when we come to the annual report, we should be saying what we've done, and there is no instance where we've raised through the year an issue which would have breached those. And if you have any instances, you should bring them up as we're going along, and then we'll note that. And Jim Hume.
Yes, on a completely different point, and maybe my arithmetic's wrong, but on page 5, point 30, it states the committee met 33 times during the parliamentary year, 2 in private and 21 partly in private. 21 and 2 makes 23, obviously, so there must be...
Totally in public.
All right, okay, well maybe that should be highlighted.
Okay, we can get it spelt out very clearly indeed. Any other points on page 4 or 5 as we were looking through it? If not, can we accept that the draft annual report as slightly amended is accepted and agreed to by members? Agreed. Members agreed? Thank you very much. We'll now move into private.